Hello and welcome to Comic Book Herald Deep Dives. I'm Dave Busing, founder and editor-in-chief of comicbookherald.com. I am joined today by an agent of the end times, John Galati, writer supreme over at Comic Book Herald. How's it going, John?
It's going great. I'm excited to be talking east to west.
Yeah, we are talking about Jonathan Hickman written, Nick Dragotta arted, and Frank Martin colored East of West today. We are going to be doing the first 29 issues. That's year one and year two of the Apocalypse of this Image comic series that launched in 2013. And we are going to be doing this as part one of an East of West spectacular as the series gears up for its conclusion in early 2020. We'll be doing part two in January of this month and talk about the final years of the Apocalypse. Now, John and I have been having some back and forth. I'm calling them Journals from Armageddon. I'll include a link here in the show notes. I'm going to publish these over on Comic Book Herald so you can kind of see our conversation leading up to this point. But what we wanted to do today is reflect back on what is writer Jonathan Hickman's longest and perhaps most celebrated creator-owned series. It's the one that we have ranked number 12 on the best comics of the decade list. It's the highest ranked creator-owned Jonathan Hickman book, and it's definitely one of the biggest Image hits from an era, really 2012 to like 2015. I tend to label it when Image was kind of in a golden age, kind of in a renaissance, and seemingly could do no wrong. You had 2012, you had Saga. 2013, you had an insane batch of greatness, including East of West. But you also had Remender's Black Science, Deadly Class, Greg Rucka and Michael Lark on Lazarus, Kelly Sue DeConnick, Emma Rios on Pretty Deadly. Rat Queens launched that year. Sex Criminals by Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky. So like, there's this huge wave. There's a huge influx of Image Comics properties that I think even today we still think of as their biggest hits, even though it's 6 years later. East of West, I think, is signaling the fact that it's the end of that era appropriately. That it should signal the end times as it comes to a conclusion. So we're going to talk a little bit about what we love about this, what we find interesting, what is perhaps a broader sort of like, what does East of West cover? What sort of, how is its reflection of the Apocalypse something that is just sort of always in the public consciousness as a potentially interesting storytelling measure? So let's get into it. East of West Part 1, again, issues number 1 to number 29. John, first question I have for you is East of West as good as its reputation? And if it is, how does it manage that?
I think it is. This is one of those rare comics that I think actually holds up to a lot of what people say about it. But on rereading it, I was surprised to find out that it holds up in a very different way than what I expected.
Yeah.
Like, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I had forgotten how little the beginning of it was action-oriented and how much it was pursuing goals in a different way, which I think makes it a superb book. But, it's very different than kind of what you expect from the end of the world. And that time and time again, the series really delivers on this idea of making readership question how we think the world should end, what we expect or demand of an apocalypse. It's a fascinating take, and it's kind of gutsy when you think about how common the apocalypse is to both pop culture and to comics mediums.
Right. So to back it up, East of West, for those who are less familiar, is a story. It jumps in the year 2064. It's a semi-alternate history, I suppose. It's a little Watchmen-like in the sense of it's our world, but imagine if the Civil War played out differently, essentially. And in the wake of the Civil War, instead of the Union winning and the nation remaining together, the country fractures. And basically we get, I believe it's 7 different segments of America. So this is a look at America, and I do think it's important to note there is the rest of the world.
Yeah.
The rest of the world is out there during this story. We just don't hardly ever see it until like a mention of it in issue 20-something, when the Confederacy is working with Japan. But, you have the Union, you have the Confederacy, you have like a New Orleans kingdom, essentially, of the South. You have Texas as its own standalone kingdom. You have the PRA, which is the People's Republic, in California. You have the Endless Nation as kind of the most fascinating addition to this mythos, to them like this future so almost quite ours, American dream or American nightmare, I guess in this case, of the Endless Nation, who are Native Americans, who are small in number, in population, but have developed this incredible technology and are clearly like the superior force, I guess, in this American world, which is, I think, a really interesting flip, an inverse of the way America has typically treated Native Americans, subjugating, pushing them out of their land, right? It's sort of them reclaiming their power in this world, okay? So you have all these different factions, and then you also have a very supernatural, religious, mythological insertion of the literal four horsemen of the apocalypse, are with Death as sort of our main character. And when we start the story, the four horsemen of the apocalypse have already come. They came to Earth, but Death, he fell in love. And he fell in love with who will go on to become the premier, I believe. Is it the Mao of the PRA? She's the leader, for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
And fell in love and had a child. So Death, the horseman, he has separated. Things have broken. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are no longer together in the way that we picture them. And that is kind of where we start our story. Is the apocalypse? The three horsemen remaining are trying to make the apocalypse happen in a nice, orderly fashion. Death is unleashing chaos, and we have all this political intrigue going on around the powers that be, those who are aware of this religion and contributing to it, and trying to manufacture the end times for reasons that I will say remain quite mysterious throughout most of the run. You know, and then you have those who are just sort of trying to maintain, like, you know, the actual state of things in this sort of broken, fractured America. So there's a lot to it, and I think that is the thing that East of West does best. Is it's not like the main protagonist, I guess, is Death. You know, he's all white, this pale white horseman. He's very much a Western style, like, you know, lawman. But there are so many characters. The story's about the world. You know, the story's about the world dealing with the apocalypse, and structurally it flows that way. It bounces from character to kingdom to narrative, like with almost reckless abandon, but it never feels to me, at least, like it doesn't know what it's doing, which I think is one of Hickman's strengths. So that's East of West in short. One thing I was saying to you before we started, John, is I think East of West is... I constantly, as it was coming out, had the experience of feeling like I needed to go back and read it all again to understand what was happening. And while that's a good thing in some ways, it's also really hard when you're on like issue 18 and the third year of publication. And I don't actually want to read 17 issues to get back to this point. Now, binging it again works brilliantly. Yeah. Is this a book that was always destined for the binge? You know what I mean? Like most books should be. Like, is this one almost 100%? You almost need to read it all at once to kind of appreciate it?
Yeah, I think it might have been. You know, I kind of want to start by saying that given the difficulties that this book has had in coming out on time or coming out at all at certain points in times, that there's a part of me that wonders if there wasn't a different East of West script that was available at some point and they changed it to follow, you know, the publication schedule that they could manage.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to say that it was always destined to be binged in the way this one was. But yeah, like going back over it, it reminds me a lot of classic plays. We were talking about it beforehand, but I had the experience of reading it through the second time and following very different characters than I did the first time. That I picked a whole new set of protagonists for the most part and kind of zeroed in on them as I was reading. People who I kind of missed the first time around, really. Yeah. And it still holds up and tells this incredibly interesting story. And the binging aspect of it, I think, does the best for me in that it does a great job of pointing out really the historical accuracies, or I guess what we should say are historical truths of some event for this older version of America. Because the PRC, in its structure of having various different Maos, feels like it's finally completely taken over Buddhism. which has been kind of an uncomfortable back and forth between the Chinese government and the religion for ages. But in that sense, it has this really clear idea of a Chinese monoculture kind of situation that's going on there. The situation that's happening with the Endless Nation and their, way crazy technology is one, I realized this time, kind of a nice little nod to the supernatural assumptions that some people have about certain Native American tribes, that there's this idea that when the Sioux and the Lakota disappeared, that they were actually taken away and became star people. Which is this nice little, I don't know if that's what he was intending, but it feels like a nice nod. It was also very interesting to see what that technology did to the humanity of these people.
Yeah.
There's that great scene. I don't want to get too specific early on, but there's that great scene early on where there's the big fight, the political get together between the different forces of darkness, basically. And the Chosen. The Chosen. Thank you. Yes, the Chosen. And the head of the Endless Nation says, "We are the only lives that matter."
Yeah.
Which is so the antithesis of any kind of Native American folklore, which is, devastating and terrifying to me. I think that's where binging has really helped me, because it's helped me connect all the little dots along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think there's each faction of this world is fascinating. And I think that's one of East of West's greatest strengths is when the book opens with one of the 7 new territories. Maybe we haven't been to the kingdom in a while, right? I was just saying how Crown Prince John Freeman has become one of my favorite characters, even though the first read, I couldn't have told you hardly a thing about him.
Yeah.
When we travel to these places, you want to know how they work. I want to know sort of how they got that way and what it's like actually living in this world, right? And the political rulers, the decisions that they make, and the sacrifices and sort of the tug and pull that they've had in terms of maintaining who they are, but also maintaining their presence in this world that is, when we start the book, not yet at war, but by the time year 1 is over, is very much at war because, it's like everything's on a knife's edge, right? You can tell. There's the apocalypse coming, but then there's also the normal standard just we are going to go to war because we are political rivals and we are trying to occupy a relatively similar space. So I do think that's one of the most fascinating things about this book is it bounces around this world super successfully. It's almost always intriguing. And there are a few books that I can't quite put down, like East of West, for reasons that are almost hard to explain. I think one of the things about it is it sort of just feels like it never ends. Even with cliffhangers and with hanging threads, it's almost just one big conversation. Yeah. It's just one big fascinating conversation about the fate of this world. And to stop feels like to stop in mid-conversation. And it's always well, I might as well read the next issue because this isn't a stopping place. It's not even like a cliffhanger. I have to know what happens. I mean, I do want to know what happens next. But it's also just I want to hear this person finish their sentence. I want to hear Chamberlain's next witticism. So before we get to, I think, kind of the use of the apocalypse and some of your thoughts on kind of why that resonates in such a way as East of West does, I do want to talk about Hickman as a creator here. Not to overlook Dragotta and his art, which is, I mean, if Nick Dragotta is not the artist on the book, this book doesn't work the way that it does. The designs and this world that is futuristic yet ours, and even Death riding his, I think it's an Endless Nation horse that is a cylinder with a laser eye. It's it's got this proto-future, almost cyberpunk look to it, and it's all every design. When they show the White Tower in the Union, when they show the Black Towers in the Confederacy, I'm this book looks astonishing. When it shows beasts and demons and violence, it's grotesque. It's horrifying, there are so many eyeballs in this book. If you're squeamish about eyeballs, you might want to reconsider East of West because the tendrils and the fluids and just everything about it is it's gross. But then there's also beauty to it, You know, like it knows when to step back and just, or Dragotta and Martin and the team knows when to step back and show sort of the remaining beauty in this world before it comes to its end. But Hickman obviously has made his name at Marvel, writing some incredible stories that I am a huge fan of. I picked them for my favorite comics of the decade, all of Hickman's Marvel work. East of West is a real, I think, it's a real test for how you feel about his writing style. Because if you are into it, as I am, and I think you are, it is sort of like almost the perfect distillation of the way that he clearly prefers to write, which is to have everyone speak as if they are writing down like a philosophical quote. Like every sentence is a quotable, you know, and no one speaks in stutters or paused cadences like I'm doing now, you know, in just natural, like trying to formulate a thought. Everyone has formulated every thought they're ever going to have and distilled it down to these incredible, like you should frame them on a wall above your computer, quotables. That's how almost everyone talks at all times. And Hickman is still able to generate character through this. Like Death has a briskness to him. He is the Western lawman, right? Chamberlain, the Southern leader of the Confederacy, he has an arrogance and sort of a detached hubris to him. He is constantly scheming. And, right, you get bits of character through it, but everyone also has a sameness to them in that they will respond with, you know, like these very fully formed, well-articulated ideas at all times. And I actually had the thought, Brian Michael Bendis, the writer who did so much work at Marvel, comes under fire a lot now for his style of dialogue that is just, it is so familiar because he's used the same thing for approximately 20 years.
Yeah, decompression.
What's that?
Decompression,
and of having, you know, a panel of back and forth with characters saying, hey, are you talking to me? Yeah, I'm talking to you. Me, right? Yeah, you. And, right, he just does that thing, and it's become kind of mockable and memeable. I think Hickman's actually would be similarly mockable if it wasn't so hard to replicate. Because to replicate it, you have to have everyone respond like they're geniuses.
Yeah.
And that's just hard to come up with. So that's the thing where I can read, there's a degree of focus and there's a degree of attention I have to pay to everyone talking to literally understand what they're saying. They are not necessarily complex words, but they are complex thoughts. Sometimes I think they don't mean anything at all, right? And I think it's almost it's a atmosphere, you know, that it's creating. But it's like so rarely are characters just saying like, here's a thing I'm doing. It's like, here's an idea I had about the state of avarice. Yeah. I'm like, well, okay, let me reflect on that for a moment. So what do you think about the writing style of East of West? And do you, because I think he uses similar things and like I said, like there is humor in this book. It comes out, especially later when we get to Babylon, who's the great beast potentially and the son of Death and Xiaolin. Hickman's writing, do you think, like, am I overstating how perhaps I don't want to say repetitive because that doesn't feel right, but how stylistically uniform it can feel?
No, I agree with you there. I think it's interesting how it sometimes gets used for effect. Like you said, you brought up the fact that you feel that sometimes there are characters who are saying things and saying nothing. I think that Hickman did a great job with that with Bell Solomon, especially early on, where Bell is the one guy who doesn't really believe. And I don't know, probably within 9-10 issues, I very much got the idea that he was talking because he knew he had to say something to get through the next 5 minutes. Like, I have to prove I belong at this table. I have to prove I'm actually a believer. So I'm just going to ramble.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting kind of subversion of Hickman's own trope. The part that I've been just utterly fascinated by since the beginning was how little Hickman's apocalypse has to do with any other apocalypse, really. Like, it's not super tied into the Judeo-Christian ideas, because there's not really forces of heaven and hell. You know, there's not good and bad.
There are demons here, but certainly there are not gods.
No, there's no god.
I don't think.
And there's not really, I don't know, they seem to be more relying on human beings being more the force of darkness than demons being it, right?
Well, and that feels like a strong theme, is a pessimism and a deep lack of hope in humanity, right?
Yeah.
That's definitely at the heart of this.
Yeah, definitely. But, you know, in terms of iconography, you know, there's no flaming swords, there's no rivers of blood, or, you know, so many other things that we usually associate with that aspect.
Right.
It doesn't have a big tie-in with any of the Eastern apocalyptic stuff that I've been reading. It's fascinating because it's kind of just his own take and his own idea, which I like. Yeah, it pays some lip service. It's got the beast that's slouching, or Babylon, the great beast. It's got, you know, the four horsemen. But sort of after that, it doesn't have a whole lot.
Isn't it almost like the pop culture Christianity version of the apocalypse? Like, if you take, like, yeah, I've never read Revelations, but I could tell you, like, oh yeah, like there's the beast of the apocalypse and there's the four horsemen. Like, not to make a go House of X territory, but like it's almost the X-Men apocalypse version of the apocalypse, right?
I can see that.
Do you think it's missing something, not taking on other elements?
The first time I read it, I sort of did. Like, I was maybe a little bit disappointed. But going through it this time, I felt by not taking on those elements, which come with like loaded presuppositions, without taking on those elements, Hickman was kind of free to say his own stuff.
Yeah.
And say, like, this is what this means. This is what I'm concerned about in this part of the story. You know, I think that's been a really brave and gutsy move on his part, because it doesn't pull much from like Terminator, which people usually pull from. It doesn't pull from Akira, which people usually pull from if they're doing pop culture apocalypses. You know, it doesn't have, maybe it has a little bit of the Matrix, but not much. You know, it's a real gutsy move to have this kind of stripped down, efficient apocalypse that doesn't hide behind pyrotechnics and special effects.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because generally, when you think of apocalypse narratives, there's a lot of like post Fallout. And we talked about this in our note exchange, but like literally the video game Fallout is one that comes to mind for me. That is post nuclear apocalypse. Sure. Here, the apocalypse is building and brewing, but like everything's kind of fine, you know. Like the world is, there's a lot of tension, like we feel in our world, right? Like there's a lot of tension, but actually everyone's like, nothing's been nuked yet. Nothing has been blown up until we get to year 2 and like war begins. But even that is still like, well, it's not the apocalypse yet. You know, even though we know, because we have these behind the scenes views of the Chosen and the message and their religious belief that, you know, and obviously we've seen so much of the three horsemen who are Conquest, War, and Famine, who are attempting to bring this about. Like, we know it's coming and they're building to it, but actually it's a pre-apocalypse book that is almost all about like the inevitability of this coming apocalypse, as opposed to, hey, it already happened. Here's how people are coping, you know?
I've got a slight bone to pick about pre-apocalypse versus post-apocalypse, but I agree with a lot of that. Yeah, it's just so endlessly fascinating to me. I like the fact that there's not a ton of direct conflict early on.
Yeah.
Which is another hallmark of like of traditional pop culture apocalypse stuff. It does so many things so well and so intelligently. The idea that like the end of the world comes on slowly and always feels like within the normal parameters. You know, you can later on you can see the capital city of the Union is kind of falling apart. It's descending into martial law and just total chaos. The Madam President is arresting just civilians in the street and executing them. You know, it's terrible. But the fact that feels like almost a normal political happenstance is crazy.
Yeah, right.
But it's just built to that point, and on top of which the fact that like that would be at any other time a sign of the apocalypse, this level of unrest. But now we have media and we have marketing and we have spin, so we can keep people from realizing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a scary thought.
Yeah.
I think, actually, the more I think about it and hear you say that, I do think you're right. I'm calling it pre-apocalypse, but really what it is just the apocalypse happening and we haven't realized it yet.
Yeah, a really well-managed apocalypse. Like the world
Because by
started...
the time... Well, I was just going to say, by the time you realize it happened, it's too late.
Yeah.
That was the end.
Exactly.
So the actual act of it happening is earlier.
I guess my big takeaway from reading this book was I was shocked at how orderly Jonathan Hickman managed to make the end of the world. That things were clear. I mean, even when they were political and they were full of intrigue, I felt I knew what was happening. I felt I knew what was going on sort of off screen, so I could follow another story that we had put down previously and we'll come back to. Everything seemed to sort of make a logical sense, and on top of which at all times I could tell, who was pressing for advantage or who was being wounded or hurt or who was being, waylaid or whatever, which again is so unlikely for most, pop sci-fi apocalypses right now, that we tend to have these gigantic climactic battles where you have no idea who's on top. And very often motivations get pushed to the side in order to get in more explosions or more body count or more tragedy. So, that Hickman was doing that was really fascinating. And it's kind of what pushed me to do the deep dive and read up on this idea. And there's a modern school of thought right now in theology that says that mankind has always made these stories, the end of the world stories. That they were the first ones we wrote down. We created a language just to do it, and we've been at it ever since. That every major culture makes one. So the question is why? And the consensus idea right now, well, I shouldn't say consensus, but one of the leading ideas right now is that mankind does it to make order out of a frighteningly chaotic universe. That if you look at 2 million years of human history from Homo erectus on, human beings have just been possessed by this idea that they can conquer the entire world, but death will always be arbitrary and kind of capricious. So the apocalypse was really a way of saying, like, no, we will put death into order, especially the idea of, like, if the entire world is going to end, that's going to be very orderly. It's going to tell us when it'll happen. It'll have these milestones that go along the way. That it's gonna happen in a single file kind of line, and that we can all feel a sort of catharsis by this idea that we won't die in a panic.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because it's so applicable to what we're talking about in this story. Like, you can very easily fit the Chosen and the Horsemen into that, no, this needs to happen orderly category, even if some of them, like Chamberlain and Bell Solomon, are ultimately not that into that idea. They're kind of playing along because they can predict and scheme against order better than they can predict and scheme against variables, right? That's why Chamberlain, when he brings his, I think it's niece, into the fold, is like, you're a mathematician, you can predict game theory, you can predict the unpredictable. You can help me do that. I can't do that as well when we get outside of the confines of the order of the message and of the apocalypse. I do think that, like you said, there's the chaos components of this are... It's interesting to me how this, like, the exact things you're describing reflect, like, religion and it's not even just, like, apocalyptic religion, not even just end times prophecies, but, like, the way religion is used to retroactively, like, defend something. So things will happen in this book, especially early, and then they're like, oh, it's just like the message said. Here's this quote that perfectly sums up what just happened. And it's all done after the fact. And it's like, well, are you seeing a little of what you want to see? Like, it works. Because when Hickman wrote a cup of a cup, a chalice of a chalice before, I had no idea what he was talking about. But then you see a kid born and you add some more context to it, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, that was prophecy. So I find that piece of it very interesting. Right. I find all of the Chosen very interesting because they're all using religion for different reasons. Like there's so much to be said, and I haven't fully fleshed out the thought enough to have the conversation in tons of detail, but they're all using this religion for their own ends, whether it's to assume power, whether they really, like, the president of the union, or who becomes the president of the union, seems to be like more of a genuine believer in the order of the message and the prophecy, whereas, like I said, Chamberlain or Bell Solomon are like, no, Chamberlain's like, this is a means to an end for power. Bell Solomon's like, I don't even agree with this, but I think I can defend my Republic of Texas longer if I play along. John Freeman is there just because, like, he might actually buy into this a little bit more, but in different ways than the other, right? There's all sorts of different fascinating ways that everyone here is like, this religion matters to me because of Y, because of X, Y, Z. And I think that's very reflective of the way religion gets used in our world as well. I will say too, there's actually like a very modern real world connection to what you're talking about, which is the Mayan calendar 2012. There was an end times prediction that got a lot of publicity, right? It was very famous, that the world was going to end. I think it was December something 2012. And this book, East of West #1, comes out March 2013. So like, it is actually, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but it's like quite closely tied to that phenomenon being as popularized as I remember it. I don't remember an end times prophecy getting more attention than that this decade. And it launches right in the wake of that. And in terms of, broader messages, it is definitely like everyone in this book is scared of death. And he is literal here, right? He's I guess anthropomorphized isn't the word, but like it's a walking embodiment of death. And how everyone reacts to that fear of death sort of tells you about like what it means to live, right? So death is out here in the world and he is plotting to kill us. What do? Do we turn to the message and this religion and try to end the world before he can kill us for whatever that means, right? Because there is that lack of clarity, I think, early too. What does the apocalypse mean? What does it mean for them to end the world? So if they bring about the apocalypse and there's war and everything's on fire, what do the Chosen think they're getting out of that? And those answers seem to differ as well, right?
Yeah.
So because I think a lot of times if there's like, well, if I help these godlike beings in their aim, yes, humanity will perish, but I will ascend to a greater plane or something. I will get something better. We haven't really gotten a lot of like specifics around what those promises might be or what those expectations might be, which I find interesting because then to me it makes Chamberlain so much easier to connect to because he's like, I can enjoy good liquor and all the pleasures of wealth and power here on Earth. I don't know what I get when the apocalypse ends. Whereas the president of the union, who is about as much fun, I think, as Hickman could have, like like writing a person of power who just has the utmost disdain for her constituents. You know,
oh my God,
the peasants at her feet. She is like, she thinks highly of this, but I'm like, well, what do you think you're getting? So I find that curious as well. And maybe we'll see in part 2 if there's a little more detail around that.
Yeah, I really hope that there was no actual promise made and that these were just assumptions that the heads of the Chosen made, thinking like, oh, I'm being told this and I'm a smart person, therefore this gives me an advantage in some way. And that, you know, the president of the union believes she's a true believer, so she believes that she'll get some kind of benefit in the afterlife, as you brought up. And Chamberlain says, like, I don't believe you're here to help me because no one's here to help me, but I can use this to my advantage now. You know, the Endless Nation seems to believe that their people will be the only ones to ascend to the afterlife by the way that they talk.
Right.
And now the PRC is in the interesting position, again, very much like Buddhism, that their leader embraces and kind of loves death as this natural part of things, which is, if intentional, a really good idea. Not not sure what to say about John Freeman and his group. I don't quite understand their ilk, other than I think that they just see it as, maybe they only see the apocalypse as a way to hurt people. Like, this will weaken my enemies, so I can use it to my advantage that way. That's
interesting. I would agree, they are the trickiest ones to explore and explain. Again, like, I would like to spend more time in the kingdom, I think, in this series to get more feel of that, because the things that we know about them is they have accumulated vast amounts of wealth and are very proud of it, because obviously, like, this is the African American nation, basically, is the way that it is portrayed. I don't know if it's literally all that, like, if it's all runaways, or not runaway slaves, but like they were slaves in the uprising, the Civil War, and that is the entirety of the populace, but that's certainly what we see. So to actually basically say, like, no, we've claimed this is ours, that's more important to them to hold on to, certainly, because of the fact that they were enslaved by the likes of the Union, who now they have to, or by the Confederacy in particular, but it's like, you know, they enter into these very terse alliances with them, even though you can tell, like, they don't they're very clear, they don't respect the authority of anyone else. They are the kingdom, right? They're the only ones claiming, like, a monarchy of sorts in the way that they do. So to say what John Freeman is looking for, he's a complex character, because I think there's a mix, right? I think there's a mix of belief, because he was raised by Cheveo of the Endless Nation, and he considers Wolf his brother, right? So he's got, like, a mix of belief, but I think also of shrewdness about him, of calculating, like, I also want to see my rivals defeated, and like, or at a minimum, you know, they talk a lot about leverage, like, I want to be having leverage over them. So it's interesting. I think you could talk about each of the seven in tons of detail. You could talk about Ezra the prophet. You could talk about Babylon. Like, that's the cool thing about this book, is there's so many characters. Again, like, it's that Thronesian sense of, you can have a lot of deep conversations around various moving parts, and it can just kind of go on forever.
Well, I got to say one more for the road, because now I'm possessed of the spirit of it. Now talking to you, it's the first time that I've realized that the historical angle on the kingdom might have been that, you know, terribly speaking, the slavery was the economic engine of the South. And once that gets taken away, once the meteor hits, no wonder the kingdom would be so rich, because they just kept that economic power for themselves. And that's the best kind of vengeance that you could write into that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you know, I didn't give Hickman and Dragotta and the team, like, a ton of credit for maybe the complexity and the nuance of, like, the racial components to this book. But then when you actually step back and look at the kingdom and the Endless Nation and the you know, Shaolin and the Mao in China, it's like you have Asian Americans, African Americans, and Native Americans. These are, like, the powerful regions, and it's all of the more standard, like, you know, East Coast, you know, Union, Confederacy, Texas even, that are subjugated, that are dealing with much bigger problems, at least early in this story, and are kind of falling apart on their own. So there's definitely some thought there, and a little more care that goes into it that I do think is worth crediting, because it doesn't have. I might be wrong, and I'm sure there are people who've thought about this in some detail, and I'd be curious to hear those thoughts as well. But it doesn't have moments that make me sort of cringe or make me sort of grimace and think, like, oh, that is going to raise a red flag for a lot of people. It skirts that, I think, probably pretty intentionally. I mentioned something earlier that I just thought about, and I was going to ask about a little bit, like, so this series was slated to be developed on Amazon Prime for a TV show. And I was thinking so much about, as you talk about this, like, how similar to Game of Thrones East to West feels. I do think, in a lot of ways, the things that make it intriguing and the things that make it so popular it's the fact that it is, Game of Thrones is a medieval knights and dragons story, but the focus is on characters and almost more than anything, like, political intrigue. You know, it's about, like, power and manifestations and the ways people strive to keep it. It's like, it's a thinking, you know, it's not to be overly whatever pretending I'm smarter than I am, but it's the thinking man's Knights and Dragons, right?
Sure.
And East of West feels like the same thing, but for the apocalypse.
Yeah.
I was thinking. But I do have to just note, I just Googled East of West TV deal because I was curious when that might happen. Apparently, that's not happening anymore. I guess it was announced earlier this summer that the Amazon Prime deal fell through, which is actually really a bummer because I was really looking forward to seeing this world because I think it has that Game of Thrones potential in terms of storytelling where it's like, yeah, there's action here and you're going to dig that too. But it's really just about these characters saying and plotting, these really, really high concept ideas.
Oh, yeah, but the budget for that thing would have been astronomical. Oh.
Right. Okay, so East to West Apocalypse, you mentioned in our notes that it kind of takes on, it definitely early on, more so even than anything, a Western feel.
Yeah.
So it's got, because Death is a cowboy, he even gets his eye patch eventually.
Yeah.
He's got his 6-shooters, but he's still the Death Horseman. It feels like a Western in the apocalypse, and you were kind of asking, like, is the Western the American, is that just the setting for the American apocalypse that makes the most sense? My response to this, I was looking first at like the Fallout video games where it is very much like, it feels like, you're going into like old town saloons in this apocalypse. Like it feels like the Western is almost a regression to Americana becomes a like post Fallout apocalypse. I was curious if you had more thoughts since we've talked about like why a Western might make sense for an apocalypse setting, and then also like, do you think East to West holds up as a sort of Western as it progresses? Because I think it gets away from it a bit.
To answer the second question first, I would definitely agree that it gets away from it after a while.
Yeah.
I think that that's sort of just an early framing device for it.
Yeah.
For me, I think there's a good argument to be made that the Western could be the American version of the apocalypse, either because it represents manifest destiny and some of the most stressful and bloody parts of American history, really. Because like the Western has its roots in the Civil War and then builds out from there into the Gold Rush and practically until like the beginning of television almost. Certainly the beginning of radio is when the Western period falls off. And it has a whole lot of ideas about our national identity, about individualism and the fact that might makes right, this concept of frontier justice and our inability to be comfortable underneath the rule of an authority. All those things stand pretty well, but I don't know. It's also really an uncomfortable question because it does strike so much at our own idealism. We have so lionized the idea of the sheriff keeping the town safe or the cowboy protecting his family and his land that it gets really uncomfortable to kind of say like, well, what were you protecting these things from? And what was sort of the degradation of the Western over time where like originally, ironically, the Western was more evenly split between, at least on television, was more evenly split between the idea of the white Anglo-Saxon people fighting the quote-unquote savage Native American, tragically, and the idea of white people having to fight other white people because racism sort of prevented us from hiring enough actors of color to maintain storyline in a lot of cases. Jeez, like we usually wound up having to hire people who were Italian or something. So we wound up writing a lot of stories about how it's basically like the same idea of Roadhouse, right? That like you have this town that's under siege by a rich guy who's buying up parts of it and terrorizing the locals and taking the women. And a cowboy comes from out of town to lay waste to these things, whether it's John Wayne or it's Clint Eastwood in Pale Rider or whatever else, And the fact that we kind of drifted away from that over time is a whole story unto itself. I don't know. It's a whole weird thing, but it's fascinating to me the way it lines up together well. The idea that Westerns almost always take place out in the dry, arid desert. Mm-hmm. They are full of cruelty, and it's very easy to overlay a biblical apocalyptic image on top of that.
Yeah.
And then you have Westerns like Pale Rider or El Topo who do it, intentionally. So
yeah, I do think Death, the character of who is, I kind of said at the front, like, if anyone's the protagonist, it's Death. Even though one of the curious things about this book is we'll go issues without hardly seeing him or seeing him for one or two panels. We almost always see Death in those arid desert westerny conditions, or he's walking into a saloon. Like there's a moment very early on where we actually see him in the city, in the future world, in the White Tower, assassinating the president is kind of the book's big opening kick. But like otherwise, we generally see him traveling the wastelands as a sort of a Western figure. I do think, too, I don't know the significance of it, or I have to think there's some thought behind this. He's also traveling with members of the Endless Nation and the Native Americans, so you're almost instantly subverting the white cowboy versus Indian, cowboys and Indians, sort of like trope that obviously is steeped in a lot of racial baggage. So like that's, I imagine an attempt to be like, yeah, we're not doing that. We're doing the opposite of that, and that's important.
Totally. Well, also, like, not only is that a nice political nod that he's doing, but that adds to the idea that death is universal and does not care who you are. He will come for you regardless. And I don't know, even the idea, because I noticed this when I was doing the second reading, as you said, death sometimes doesn't show up for quite some time.
Yeah.
But there is always the threat of death. Death is always in the room. And that's part of the most interesting idea for me is how that protagonist managed to bind together the whole story by himself, even when he's not around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. So here's a tough one then. We have this story that is sprawling across dozens of characters, regions. At the end of the day, we have 2 years of in-narrative story here, 29 issues. What is East of West trying to say? I think like what is the message of this book? Not the all capital message, but right. Or is there one? I guess is another question, because it's a book that I don't find depressing. Right? I do not read I do not read East of West and think like this is a cynical, depressing book. I actually don't think that. Yeah. But when you kind of look at it, the politicians are as corrupt as can be, right? The world is on fire, sometimes literally. Mm-hmm. Everything is awful. And I think there's a lot of like sort of broad connecting you can do to that to say like, yeah, that kind of feels like how our world feels a lot of the time. You know what I mean? So like we were talking before, like the political components of this feel specific enough to reflect like what is happening in the world, but they also are broad enough to be like kind of endless. And I think that's part of the appeal is, this book was written in 2013, 2014, well before the election of 2016 in America. It's not actually a commentary on that. Hickman, as talented as he is not that predictive, I don't think. Yet the themes and the ideas are broad enough to be like, the world's on fire. What, let's tell that story. There's a lot of talk about like, it's a hopeless world that we live in. What is this book fighting against that? Because the people who are actually like trying to prevent the apocalypse are, one, the literal embodiment of death, and two, maybe the Texas Ranger, and Belle Solomon, and I guess Xiaolin, because they took her hands and they took her son. But we really don't have a lot of people fighting the apocalypse, in a weird way, right? Like it's kind of like the horsemen and the chosen are almost warring, like trying to bring about this apocalypse with almost no resistance. Yet it is so challenging because they keep fighting amongst themselves, which is interesting. Yeah. But is this a book about hopelessness, or like is there actually a message of some sort of redemption or positivity in this? Because I don't read it and think, gosh, everything is awful. Like, that's not how it makes me feel, but I also don't know that it's saying a lot beyond that.
Okay, that's a real big question. So I guess this is the part in our podcast where I plug the fact that I'm writing another deep dive, this time around prophecy, to talk about, historically how that superpower has been manifested in human history, or at least the concept of it, and how it gets used in comics. So in the process of reading up about that one for my 10,000 words or whatever it's going to turn out to be, there's a section that I came across that was on the philosophical idea, the secular idea of the apocalypse. Most notably, it was brought up by Heidegger. And to massively oversimplify what he said that, the state of being, to be truly aware of yourself and your life, is to be constantly thinking about the end of the world. That these things are entwined. And his argument, as he went on to talk about it, is the fact that a lot of people try and avoid the truth of that, or try and keep from examining what that means for their lives, which leads to many people, and especially it's definitely representative in the comic, but people who are focused on an end without thinking about the fact that there's a whole lot of middle you have to get through. And there are choices to be made, and there are things to be considered, and there's happiness to be given or tragedy to be wrought.
I think that's what makes Chamberlain such a good character and such an appealing character, because he's all middle. He's like, I know the end's coming. I'm self-aware enough. I want to enjoy the middle, and here's how I'm going to make it happen.
Yeah. And granted, he's selfish, but he's the only guy who's really thinking about the fact that, I can just do anything. Where everyone else, I shouldn't say everyone, but most other players in the game and the Chosen seem to have this idea that they're just locked into a path. And I think that the book presents, I don't know that it's hopeful, but it presents the opportunity for hope, because it says, if you just accept that this is a thing that you are doing in a way that the world works, you can get, the happiness that you need out of the world. You can be a good person or fulfilled, or you can change your behavior at any time. And that's sort of, we definitely see that with Death. We see that with Wolf, at least. I don't know that we've seen that yet with Crow. We see that with Xiaolin. This idea that you can just step off the path and, do what either fulfills you or you feel is the right thing to do.
That's an interesting answer. I like that a lot. And what I was thinking about hopefulness is probably the next phase of that question, in the form of Babylon, in the form of the son of Death and Xiaolin, and his now choices he has to make. Am I going to become the great beast? Am I going to become the great destroyer? Or am I just going to be a kid? So Babylon has this major choice to make, and I do think in him we see both the hopelessness and the hopefulness of the children of youth, which is obviously it's a very big broad metaphor, but I do think when we're thinking about, if you look at the state of the world, if you look at American politics or UK politics, just had a major election that I know upset a lot of people, right? And you think how can this be, right? How can so many people think this other thing than what I think, which I think in East to West, how can so many people want the end of the world, right? Is is kind of how it feels. I actually do think that is a metaphorically very real feeling. You might look to, and I think this a lot, but at least young people maybe are moving more towards a more hopeful future, right? Maybe young people are the answer, right? Think of the kids, think of the children. And I think Babylon is very much the embodiment of that metaphor, despite the fact that the message proclaims him to be the great beast, right? So he is the ultimate, will I follow the order of apocalypse, or will I step off the path, like you said, and create something new? And I do think the decision that is made in part 2 of this podcast, when we talk about the very end of the comic regarding the fate of Babylon, will tell us a lot about how Hickman sees this question, and how Dragotta and Martin and the rest of the team see this question, because I again, like, I don't have a ton of hope that Babylon's going to be like a big hero. You know, there's just too much like kill your idols, and we're not playing. It's a little like Adrian Veidt at the end of Watchmen. You know, like, I'm not some dime store supervillain. You know, like, it's thinking above that, certainly. So I don't think Babylon's just going to be like, I love you, Dad, Mom, everything's going to be great. But how they answer that question specifically will tell us a lot about how East of West ultimately like viewed our world, I think.
Totally. Yeah. And I love the interplay with the fact that the three horsemen came back as children and are still indoctrinated into their, path of destruction. Meanwhile, Babylon is born a child probably around the same time and is force-fed the same messaging, but he has enough awareness to be able to make a choice that the horsemen don't seem to be able to make. And that contrast is fascinating to me. I can't wait to see how they play that off in the end. Because there's got to be a conflict between the two, between the three horsemen and Babylon himself.
Right. Yeah, making the three resurrected horsemen children is such an interesting decision because they are. It's almost wrong to call them evil because they just are their natures, right? They are what they are designed to be. There is also a bigger question. I don't know if you have an answer to this about like, who do they answer to, right? Because I think like broadly, they are following the message, but they're, kind of like we said, in terms of restructuring the apocalypse, there's no like, and this message comes from God above type thing that I've seen, at least that I can remember, certainly in part 1. So that'll be interesting as well. Like it's just what they are and what they do. And there's no really breaking out of it for them. With the exception of maybe Conquest, who, does have this motherly affection, or it's a weird motherly relationship with Ezra, the prophet of the end times.
Well, yeah, like to conquer something is to want something, right? And to want something is cousin to loving something. So that was a great pickup by Hickman. I also got the idea reading specifically about the three horsemen, the idea that, one, I thought that they were following the message in the way that very small children will just blindly follow an authority. Like, they just naturally assume that it's practically divine in nature and must be followed. And on top of which, that there's an aspect to kids that you could interpret as like pure evil, because they're possessed purely by need at times and have no concept of the damage that they cause in order to do that, which is, not actually to say they're evil. Please don't at me. But, it's very easy to see young kids playing and be like, that's almost gruesome. It's a frightening thing to see at times.
Right.
So
no, I can relate, just in the sense of having two very young children, where it's like you need to guide them to protect some of those more animalistic instincts, and if you guide them, like if I was into the idea of my son biting people, I could have that. I could make that happen. I have generally chosen not to. So, okay. Did you have any other big East of West Part 1 ideas? I mean, I think my takeaway for this for everyone is, through everything we've said, this book is really, really fascinating, I think, in many, many ways. I think you can read this and pick up a lot of different messages, a lot of different ideas, and frankly, a lot of different highlights. It is, I think, like you said, it is a bit Shakespearean in terms of like, the scope of it and just the nature of the storytelling. There are sequences where, again, like, it's so much more about the conversations people are having than it is about anything actually happening, which can be frustrating, I think, sometimes in storytelling. But here I just find it, I like I said, it's a page turner. So if that sounds appealing to you or sounds incongruous to you, I would recommend either way checking it out for yourself if you haven't already. If you have explored the story, we're going to be back with part 2, where we talk about issues 30 to 45 as East West comes to a conclusion in January 2019. So please consider liking and subscribing. If you're watching via the Comic Book Herald YouTube channel, subscribe to Best Comics Ever, the podcast, Or as always, you can find John and myself writing over at comicbookherald.com. All right, John, this has been a lot of fun. Again, this is just part 1. We're going to come back in part 2, but I think this will do it for us. As always, we'll include links in the show notes to the notes that we took, which I think covers actually quite a bit more than what we talked about here, if you can believe it. And again, we'll be back with part 2 in January 2019. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Dave.
And as always, enjoy the comics.
Take care, everybody.